Hello everyone. Today we are pleased to welcome Edwin Hodge, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And we are going to talk about post-truth politics. But first of all, Edwin, can you tell us a word about your research? Extremism, far-right activism, Star Trek?
Sure. So I study a fairly broad range of topics, but in this context, the research that I'm working on is I'm examining political and social extremism on the North American far right. So my research primarily looks at conspiratorial movements, that is, groups like QAnon, but also I look at extremist groups like sort of more traditional white supremacist organizations, ethno-nationalist groups, anti-immigration groups, anti-government paramilitary groups, that sort of thing. So basically, I study the very, very outer edge of the North American far right.
Okay, very interesting. And about this post-truth politics, in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries proclaimed post-truth as the buzzword of the year. This expression in this dictionary means relating to circumstances in which objective facts have less influence on the formation of opinion than the appeal to emotions and personal beliefs. What do you think about this terminology, and what does it serve to describe?
I actually think that definition doesn't go far enough. In my research, sort of in the things that I've looked at, post-truth politics doesn't just mean appeals to emotion or appeals to opinion. That's common. That has been a mainstay of not just political discourse, but of discourse, period. Post-truth politics in North America, to me, this describes the erosion, not of, it's not about favoring opinion over fact. It's about the annihilation of truth as a concept. If you take a look, the most obvious example, of course, is Kellyanne Conway, way back in early 2017, positing that the White House, under the Trump administration, was operating under a set of alternative facts. There are, of course, no alternative facts. There are facts and there are not facts. Alternative facts is a sort of an interesting kind of newspeak to mean we'll just generate positions based on a new kind of truth, a truth that it doesn't really relate. It relates less to objective, observable, empirical reality, and more to the way the way we think the world should run. So post-truth, in my view, isn't just about appeals to emotion. It's about the systematic deconstruction of sort of consensus, a reality-based consensus. This is how you end up with things like climate deniers, who the objective truth, the empirical truth, is that the world is warming, that humans are the primary driver of this, and we need radical change in order to stop it, or even to slow the damage. And their response is, no, we'll just invent a whole new ecosystem of think tanks and lobby groups that will peddle a different kind of fact, a fact that isn't in fact factual.
Yes, and if we link this post-truth politics with the concept and the institution of democracy, of North American democracy, how can democracy and democracies, the institutions and also the concept, could defend themselves against these threats, against this strong and strange movement?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Democratic institutions, especially in the global north, the way that we've developed them over the past century or so, democratic institutions rely on bureaucracies, right? On bureaucratic institutions, which are themselves reliant on a kind of reality-based consensus, right? Policy is derived from empirical observation, from empirical research. It's colored, it's filtered through ideology. But at its foundation, there is at least some observable truth that we can see, some observable facts. In this more sort of post-truth world, what we've seen, if we take the Trump administration as our example of a post-truth democracy, we take a look at a Trump-era America, we can see pretty quickly that democratic institutions don't fare well. The Trump administration overtly politicized virtually every department, down to things like housing and human services, right? Down to the Environmental Protection Agency. These were all politicized because the Trump administration, right, and the politicians that supported it simply didn't care what truth is. They didn't care what the empirical facts were. When they replaced, when the Trump administration replaced these officials with sort of Trump appointed, hacks, for lack of a better term, we saw pretty quickly how easily those democratic institutions were eroded. And I know that there's a lot of American politicians now and a lot of people now who look at the Biden administration and go, oh yeah, see, our democracy survived. I am less confident in that claim than perhaps they would like me to be.
And that's a perfect transition about this Capitol event 1 month ago. What do you think about this event?
I think that's trying to find a silver lining in an otherwise horrific day. Claiming that democracy is strong because it survived an insurrection ignores the fact that the insurrection was allowed to happen in the first place. Strong, stable democracies don't have armed insurrections, right? That's kind of the definition of a stable democracy. So the fact that the United States experienced one, and now after the fact says, oh, well, see, it didn't destroy our country. Well, that's a pretty low bar. That's a pretty low bar. And it's not one that I would say, oh, well, okay, I agree with you. You have a healthy democracy. Let's take a look at the immediate aftermath. It is an empirical, observable fact that Trump supporters on the far right, allied or with the tacit endorsement of sitting members of the American Congress, stormed their Capitol buildings, destroyed property, killed people, and were actively seeking, they were actively hunting sitting members of Congress. Right? That is an empirical fact, right? Those are the facts as we saw. We saw it unfold. We didn't even need a news agency to tell us this because the insurrectionists were live streaming themselves. We know this happened. In a strong and healthy democracy, what would be the outcome? Well, we would see massive charges, right? And we have seen that in the United States. We would also see accountability. The people who spurred this on would be held to account. That hasn't happened, right? It is not controversial to say that Donald Trump egged them on, right? He straight up told them to march on the Capitol, right? As Mike Pence, as insurrectionists were hunting for Mike Pence, right, to hang him, Donald Trump was tweeting that Mike Pence was a coward for not doing what needed to be done. Mm-hmm. What needed to be done, in Trump's view, literally overthrow the democratic process. Elected officials supported the insurrectionists. Yeah, that seems like a textbook definition of, or textbook example of treason. And yet they're still sitting in the House of Reps. Donald Trump's impeachment went nowhere, not because the facts failed to condemn him, but because his own party is so terrified of his base that they supported him. They engaged they're sycophants, right? These are not the signs of a healthy democracy. These are all of the hallmarks of a deeply troubled democracy. And I think that Americans, I honestly think Americans need to sit down and have a real discussion with themselves about what's going on. My worry is that they not only won't, but can't have that discussion.
And this conclusion you have about this United States democracy, what are the effects? Because in Canada, you are the first neighbor with Mexico. And what are the influences of this strong movement of post-truth politics with this example of Trump, as you described? What could Canada do? What is the situation in Canada? What could you share with us?
I mean, as much as in Canada, it's a standard sort of belief in Canada, a standard hobby, if you will, of the Canadian population to compare ourselves to the Americans, and to sort of, we like to see ourselves as morally superior to Americans in a lot of ways. So much so, in fact, that in the mid 20th century, American diplomats often, with frustration, would often refer to Canada as the stern stepsister or stern stepdaughter of God. The idea was that Canada was sort of saw itself as the moral voice or the conscience of America, right? So we have this long tradition in Canada of feeling ourselves to be morally superior to the Americans. But the truth is that we have conservative politicians in Canada who are adopting the same strategies as the Americans, right? We are seeing post-truth politics creeping in from the edges of our own political discourse. QAnon, right? This conspiratorial, extremist, pro-Trump movement has active membership in Canada. Virtually every anti-mask rally, virtually every quote-unquote pro-freedom rally that we've seen in the pandemic and the COVID era has had QAnon signs, right? This is Canada. And yet we have Trumpists. We have QAnon believers. We have the infiltration of our law enforcement and our defense apparatus, our military, by conspiratorial extremists, by white supremacists, right? We have these patterns and these social movements, the movements that, I mean, should be stuck in America, right? They should be centered in America and concerned with America. I mean, these are pro-Trump movements, and yet we've got them in Canada, right? We've seen it. And it's not even just we've seen it in the last few months. We saw it during the leadership, during the last conservative leadership rallies, right? Kelly Leach, her platform, Maxime Bernier, his platform. These are a lot of their planks were conspiratorial, or indeed post-truth. So we have these influences in Canada.
Thank you, Edwin, for this comment. And it makes me think about your one of your field of research. It was about the a-territoriality network of far-right activism. It's completely linked with the technology of the platform of communication. And for the last 10 years, with our phones in our pockets, we are completely directly linked to the discourse and narratives of the post-truth politics, but of course about a lot of different sources of influence. So what's your opinion? What are you thinking about this huge transformation, technological transformation, and the link with this post-truth movement and the a-territoriality of this network of far-right activism?
Yeah, the advent of social media has really sort of changed the landscape of knowledge production and transmission. Back in the day, right, back, you know, in the 20th century, even the early 21st century, national borders could, in some small way, they could slow or impact the flow of information, because, you know, ideas had to flow across these borders, usually attached to bodies. As technology changes, right, radio, television, it becomes easier and easier for transborder networks of sort of transborder communication networks to emerge. But the advent of social media has added something completely different. And that is the emergence of a-territorial digital spaces. These are communities that exist online that they have no foundation in a country. In fact, even the idea that the servers that these communities are being hosted on, you know, that they're in one country. Well, we're rapidly moving towards cloud-based computing, meaning that these networks form they're not attached to a server farm somewhere. They are sort of floating networks that are made up of all of the computers that are connected to them. We see this everywhere. So these networks have no territory, but they have a cultural space that ignores national boundaries. And in those spaces, people, you know, can spend their entire lives, right? Somebody who lives in Canada, they might buy their groceries here. They don't have to. They could buy them through Amazon and get them shipped across the border if that's what they wanted to do. But they buy their groceries here, they sleep here. Sure, they pay their taxes here. But their income is earned from Etsy or some online store. Their friends are all around the world, and they communicate in real time through Discord, through social media sites, through through the dark net. They can communicate in ways that can't be monitored, right? They are encrypted on both ends. You can't see what they're talking about. They can live their entire lives, the entirety of their social lives, completely ignoring the geophysical location that they're in. So these networks that are spreading information are also spreading conspiratorial beliefs, and we can see that pretty clearly. We can watch the spread of these kinds of movements in real time in our own social media feeds. We're seeing it everywhere. And you couple that, the ease of transmission, with the isolation brought on by COVID and the public health orders, you've got the perfect recipe for millions and millions of people to fall down these rabbit holes, right? Into these conspiratorial and extremist spaces.
And this spread we have in Europe. They have also populist movements, and a lot of people are Eurosceptics. So this movement of Euroscepticism is more and more higher. What lessons and what light can European countries draw from these situations faced with this rise of populism and conspiracism?
Europe's got its work cut out for it. So Euroscepticism has been kicking around since the old coal and steel community, right? The Franco-German coal and steel pacts, right? It's been around for as long as the EU has been an idea. But what we've seen is that Euroscepticism, it utilized exactly the same social media networks in Britain, in France and Germany, on the sort of the edges of Europe. It utilized the same networks that the alt-right and QAnon uses in North America to great effect. Brexit was so much of the Leave movement in Brexit was based on lies, right? It was based on like bald-faced misinformation and lies, but it spread like wildfire. And what's especially frustrating is that in North America, we were able to watch that happen And rather than take lessons from it in North America, we just assumed that it wouldn't happen here, maybe. And then when it did, we acted surprised, like, oh, how could this have happened? Well, all you had to do was watch the BNP and the Brexit campaign in Europe to see just how easily these networks move. We've also seen not just Eurosceptic networks, but we've seen the emergence of far-right groups in Spain, France, Italy, Germany, the UK, and they are building networks not just amongst themselves, but between countries as well. I think that Europe needs to really consider how they're approaching this, the challenge of countering extremist ideologies. If their strategies are not truly European, right? If there's a German approach and a French approach, if they're not truly European, and if they're not recognizing the central role that these largely unregulated social media networks have in the spread of this information, they're hamstringing their efforts before they even start.
What are the responsibilities of this social media network? We know Facebook has created its Supreme Court. We know Twitter, and they have their own charter of obligations. They should be more responsible, accountable, no? What do you think about that?
Well, the question of should is an ideological one, right? I think Facebook and Twitter, these are sort of prime examples of the kind of Silicon Valley libertarianism that has, that sort of culture that dominates the big technology companies. They don't see themselves as having any moral culpability in any of this, right? They're a platform. They are there to provide a service. They are not there to regulate. But the problem, of course, with that is the internet and increasingly these sort of social media networks, it's harder to see them as like sort of mom and pop type internet service providers or whatever. They are more like utilities. They are increasingly necessary for people to communicate, to find work, to do their jobs. And if we see them as utilities, then I think maybe maybe countries ought to consider regulating them like utilities. In Canada, we have the CRTC, right? That's a regulatory board that governs what you see and hear on radio and television in Canada. And they've only just really begun in the last few years to take up the issue of regulating what you find in digital spaces, because they've been so hands off for so long. So, I mean, the question is, it's a difficult question to answer. What should tech companies do? My personal opinion is they need to step up. They need to really recognize their position in our cultural landscape, not just as money-making machines, but as curators of information, and if they want to hold that position, right, as sort of a facilitator of communication, they need to take on the responsibilities that come along with that, I think.
You spoke about this libertarian philosophy, and behind the Bitcoin, behind the virtual cryptocurrencies, we have this idea of decentralized money, of a-state money. Like the money of the people directly without the state and without the central banks and whatnot. How could we link all these trends, Bitcoin, virtual cryptocurrencies, libertarian movement, and the conspiracies movement, technology movements, all are linked in one huge trend? And where are we going with if we could speculate a little bit about the 10 next years?
I mean, this is a really, really challenging question. I often tend to avoid sort of futurist speculations. In my view, if we're not striving towards Star Trek, we're doing it wrong. But you know, looking at cryptocurrencies, who are the big players in that? Well, I mean, you get people online who will say, "Oh, I'm just a small time guy. I just did some bit mining, and I made a bunch of money." But if you take a look at who's holding most of the funds, it's states, right? The single biggest Bitcoin wallet, I believe, is China, right? Like, so the cryptocurrencies, this idea that they're somehow going to that somehow like corporations or governments are going to keep their hands off wealth generation mechanisms. Get real. I mean, like, seriously, get real. That's absurd. So I think we're going to see increased state penetration of these sort of decentralized, stateless, these kinds of cryptocurrencies. It's only a matter of time. You think about who has the money, who has the resources to buy up crypto, who has the resources to acquire. It's not Redditors, right, on Wall Street bets. Right, it's not the Redditors in Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin subreddit. It's state actors, right, who are able to monopolize, right, to be able to marshal their power to buy. And if it's completely unregulated, there is literally nothing to stop them. So I see a lot of these movements as efforts to get out from under the thumb of the state. But the problem, I think, with a lot of these movements is they don't actually understand what the state is. I don't think they recognize the full extent of state power. I don't think that they fully understand the ramifications. So, you know, these sort of digital cowboys creating hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in wealth through cryptocurrencies, but still believing somehow that the government isn't going to try to get in that game. I mean, have they talked to elected officials ever?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I see. I see that the role of this, in a kind of ironic way, a lot of these hyper capitalist, hyper sort of libertarian impulses by these big companies and by like crypto and this sort of thing, I think are going to almost inevitably generate a state level response, because I don't think states are going away. I think that they're just going to have to adapt.
Edwin, to conclude this interview, what political message of hope can you share with our listeners? I don't know, some tools in order to defend our democracy, if we think democracy is one of the best example of how we could live all together in peace. Of course, nothing is perfect, but what's your political message? What of hope could you share with us, please?
If you are interested in saving democracy, you have to do something. There is no saving anything without action. You need to vote. You need to organize. You need to take control of the levers of power. You might not believe in a state. You might be cynical and believe that the state doesn't represent you. The state will represent you whether you want it to or not. Apathy is surrender to these kinds of movements, because guess what? These movements, in addition to being extremist and conspiratorial and fringe and post-truth, they're also doing a better job of organizing than their opponents are. So all the tools that they're using, activists can use as well, right? They can use those tools to counter what they're seeing. They can use social media networks to spread ideas about skepticism, about critical thinking. They can disrupt these networks. They can, by infiltrating them with counter information, by employing new strategies, right? Half of these movements got started as sort of trolling, right? A lot of, like QAnon, a lot of these guys were trolls when they started. So counter troll them, right? That's worked before. It disrupts these networks. For as quickly as these networks spread bad information, they are quite fragile. The idea is hard to beat. The ideas they've been kicking around. Fascism, we fought a war, 60 million people died. We fought a war to defeat fascism. It's still here. But the networks broke, and they reform every now and then, and we break them again, and they reform again, and we break them again. We can do the same with these. We have to think, we have to be smarter, right? We have to adapt our tactics, our strategies to these new environments, because they did, and that's what gave them that initial head start to build and grow the way they have.
It will be the last word of our interview. Thank you very much, Edwin Hodge. Thank you very much.